Lockdowns have increased the pressure of the matric year, and with the final exams here, Dr. Janet Viljoen, counsellor and career specialist at Boston Media House, joins us with some tips to help matrics optimise their performance by managing their exam anxiety. Well, Dr. Viljoen, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Anati. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's safe to say that unlike in previous years, this group of matriculants have had a very disruptive and highly stressful year due to the pandemic. Perhaps let's start by defining what exam anxiety is and what causes it, particularly during a pandemic.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the primary causes of exam anxiety must include that pressure, that fear of failure. There's high stakes associated with particularly the matric exams. We're obviously thinking beyond those exams to the effect that those exams will have on the rest of our lives, if you like. And we might have had lack of adequate preparation time. We know that the schooling system has been horribly disrupted during the lockdowns associated with the pandemic, and that may have affected how we feel in terms of how prepared we are to face this effective unknown, these matric exams. We might also have had previous bad experiences with a test or an exam situation, and we might be bringing that previous experience and the fear and, if you like, trauma associated with that to the experience. And we can't underestimate the effect that the pandemic and the associated lockdowns and the disruption to our lives has had on each one of us as individuals. So yes, it's the matric exams, and yes, that's the focus, but we're each a human and an individual, and we bring that to the event. So we need to perhaps, first and foremost, just be a little bit gentle on ourselves and just be kind to ourselves, and just remember that we're doing our very best.
You know, you mentioned there, Dr. Viljoen, fear and trauma, and I think that has collectively affected all of us as South Africans, not just matriculants. I would imagine it's probably just compounding the situation. But we know that there's good and bad stress. Is there such a thing as good anxiety versus bad anxiety?
Absolutely. So a little stimulation is a good thing. Now, so for instance, you don't want to be fast asleep when you approach your exam, because that won't be enough stimulation. You want to be feeling a little bit of those butterflies. That is healthy, because that tends to ensure that we perform at our best. But the minute those butterflies go over a certain level, they just explode into new territory, it's bad for us. We can't function properly. We start to have physiological responses, which include things like your hands getting sweaty, your stomach cramping, you're feeling nauseous, and that in turn leads to things that I'm sure we've all experienced at some point, which is sitting down at that desk, being handed the exam paper, and having done all the studying in the world, you suddenly go blank. So you want to ensure that you're stimulated, but you're not panicked.
Now, you mentioned some of the symptoms that one can pick out, when one is stressed or feeling anxious. And one of the first things that parents do when a child says, my tummy is sore, they don't immediately identify it as anxiety or stress. But, perhaps talk to us about what parents should do in this situation. How do we manage anxiety in almost like a healthy way? Earlier you mentioned that we need to be kinder to ourselves. But perhaps give us a few pointers as parents and teachers in terms of how do we deal with children who are presenting with those anxiety-prone symptoms.
Absolutely. I think what's really important is to acknowledge that anxiety is widespread to different degrees. And I think also to understand that it's acceptable. It's something that we should talk about. It's something that we should approach head on. Parents should certainly talk to their children, their learners, about the levels of stress they're feeling, what that stress feels like, and talk to them about what they might do to alleviate that stress. In other words, it might be get a good night's sleep. There's often a temptation to cram the night before an exam, and that really doesn't help us in the long run. You really need to take the time to close those books and get a good night's sleep, because that certainly positively influences anxiety. Another thing is, have a good breakfast the morning before an exam, and take some nice snacks with you that can sustain your sugar levels. The last thing you want is your sugar levels spiking and dropping and doing all sorts of odd things while you're trying to concentrate and trying to write the exam. So there again, parents could assist by assisting children to have the right snacks with them. And another thing that can help is to talk through a bit of a game plan with the learner. How are they going to approach this examination? What strategies are they going to use when they sit down at that desk? And how are they going to focus themselves into that moment? In other words, start to forget about all the other things that are going on and just focus on the moment, focus on the paper, take some deep breaths, feel calm, and actually take the first step, which is ultimately reading those instructions that are on the examination paper really carefully, so as to alleviate the panic that is likely to be felt.
In fact, Dr. Viljoen, that was going to be my next question. What do you actually do when you're sitting on that exam table? I think you've answered it very beautifully. Perhaps as a last question to you, is there support and enough education for teachers and school governing bodies to support learners who present with anxiety, especially those learners who, at the last moment find themselves unable, to cope?
I think that more and more there is a lot of support available, and I would encourage any learner who feels in the least bit stressed or anxious to approach a teacher, approach somebody, a parent, even a friend, a peer in your class, and talk about it, somebody you trust. And don't be afraid to verbalize your feelings. I think as soon as you verbalize them, you perhaps start to take control of them, and they start to perhaps diminish in size and fearsomeness. So yes, I do think schools go the extra mile. Certainly at Boston Media House, we have a counsellor on site, and the students are able to make an appointment to see that person. And I'm certain that's the same at many, if not all, institutions.
Well, I do certainly hope so. Thank you so much, Dr. Viljoen, for your time this afternoon. Very, very valuable inputs there from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nati.
Dr. Janet Viljoen, Counsellor and Career Specialist at Boston Media House.